Good morning and welcome to the latest RM2 webinar. The subject of today's broadcast is the case for employee ownership. Why should businesses consider this particular ownership form? My name is Nigel Mason. I'm the Managing Director of RM2. And I've spent most of my career advocating employee ownership and advising on employee ownership in all its different forms. I'm trained originally as a mathematician, so I can't help gathering statistics and data about, well, any field I'm interested in, and this is no exception. And over the years, I've collected lots of different studies, some of them very rigorous, some of them somewhat anecdotal, about the impact of employee ownership on individuals, on businesses, and on economies as a whole. And what I'm going to attempt to do in this short webinar is compress that into about 20 minutes and allow a little bit of time for questions and answers, if there are any, and then aim to wrap up after 30 minutes. So this is a brisk summary of the evidence for employee ownership. There will be a recording available on our RM2 website and on our YouTube channel, posted shortly after this session. So I thought the best way to organize this was to look at the data on 4 different levels, and we'll start with the impact on individuals, on the individual employee. We'll then look at how that operates at a more aggregate level, at the level of teams of workers and collaboration. We'll then look at how employee ownership impacts the whole firm from different angles. And finally, we'll look at the highest level of all, namely the contribution of employee ownership to the performance of the whole economy. So, somewhat ambitious claim, but as you will see, there's some interesting evidence to back that up. I need to issue the inevitable health warnings whenever stats are involved. As we all know, stats can be misinterpreted. There are many different types of employee ownership, ranging from share options to share purchase plans to collective ownership or trust ownership. Some schemes operate for the benefit of just a few employees, and others operate for all employees. And the percentage of the company owned by employees can vary from 100% to a fraction of a percent. And so these studies do span all those different types, and it's important to remember that qualification. Some of the studies are quite old. That I don't think negates their value, but some of them date back to the 1980s. They come from different countries around the world, and some are based on relatively small samples, but I've only picked studies where small samples are accompanied by quite rigorous research methods. One general hazard of any kind of survey of business performance is that they very often deal in averages, and as any statistician will tell you, it's not so much the average that matters, but how results are distributed around that average that counts most. It is extraordinarily difficult to isolate the employee ownership effect from other factors that determine the performance of a business, and there are so many different variables at play that this is always going to be a big challenge for researchers. And finally, of course, correlation is not the same as causality. And if anyone wants to spend a light-hearted few minutes looking at some examples of that, there's a really funny website which has a whole load of spurious correlations. I've picked one of the more respectable ones in this chart, but it does appear as though the divorce rate in Maine is falling thanks to less consumption of margarine. So we know now what's going to keep couples together for longer. So let's start with the impact of employee ownership on the individual employee. And what we can do with employee level surveys is obviously ask employees directly through questionnaires. And this particular set of results came from a study that was conducted by the London School of Economics, the Centre for Economic Performance, which is a very prestigious unit in the LSE. It was commissioned by one of the registrars, Computershare, in 2014. And they found that in the sample of companies surveyed, employee owners are more likely to be satisfied with their company than non-employee owners by what turned out to be a statistically significant margin. Furthermore, employee owners are more likely to believe that their company is a good place to work. Again, a statistically representative difference. And overall, all the stats in this survey pointed towards that holy grail for many business owners, which is that people in employee-owned businesses felt more engaged. And there are many more studies about the general phenomenon of employee engagement than there are about the specific instance of employee ownership. There's another very good study, which I haven't summarized here, conducted on the German-based multinational Siemens, which studied the impact of the Siemens employee share schemes around the world. So that was able to look at the impact on different countries, as well as on the kind of corporate whole. You'll find that with a quick Google. What follows then from the conclusion that employee owners are more engaged? Well, it means, and again these are results directly from that Computershare sponsored study, employee owners are less likely to take unplanned absence. It's one of the main sort of factors that show good levels of motivation. Secondly, employee owners are more likely to provide discretionary effort. In other words, do work that goes beyond the narrow role specifications, such as work voluntary overtime. Thirdly, employee owners feel more loyal and they're less likely to be looking for another job. And as we all know, unwanted labour turnover is a big cost for business, and if that can be reduced, then there is a big saving to be had. Generally, in some sectors, employee share ownership is no longer an optional extra. It's becoming the norm. That's particularly true of the technology sector. No self-respecting Silicon Valley startup could begin to trade without having put in place an arrangement for all its employees to share in some of the growth in value. And the most in-demand people now expect to be offered an equity stake. So ambitious firms can't overlook this. And therefore, employee engagement through employee ownership is something which perhaps is no longer a nice to have. If we look at the impact of employee ownership on groups of employees at the team level, my source here is a really readable book by a journalist and economist called Charles Ledbetter. A book called We Think. It was partly about the sharing economy and the collaborative options available through web-based research, but it's also very much about how teams operate. And Charles cites a number of research studies which shows that teams of employee owners tend to be more collaborative and more creative. There are fewer turf battles, there's less selfishness, there's more trust on display. Employee-owned firms tend to need fewer management layers and less supervision and control, as employees are more likely to be self-directed and self-managed, and the teams more autonomous. And so this form of ownership is very congruent with organizational structures that work best in industries such as the creative industries and know-how businesses, where cross-divisional collaboration is critical to success. And employee ownership builds trust, therefore, between teams, but also within teams in large organizations, as everyone is aligned to a common goal. So it's no surprise that some of the most innovative technology companies in the world have completely embedded and entrenched employee ownership schemes for all their employees, and that covers all the big names such as Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft. They're all very progressive users of employee ownership. A lot of RM2 clients are private companies, and a lot of them are entrepreneurial early stage companies backed by venture capital. And that sense of alignment of employees with a corporate goal is particularly true when ownership is part of the pursuit of the eventual sale of a company. It makes the exit route a very open and explicit objective and not a taboo subject, and it makes everyone share in the benefits of the exit when it eventually happens, and is a much more aligned model than would be the case without employee ownership. If we then look at the next level up in the hierarchy, at the level of the firm, there are a number of studies that I've referenced on this slide. The Cass Business School in the City of London has published a number of employee ownership studies which can be found on their website. The one I'm going to cite here refers particularly to the notion of resilience when economies suffer a downturn. The American organization, the National Center for Employee Ownership, is an excellent treasure trove, really, of research and studies, mainly freely available on their website. One of the best aggregations of evidence is found in a report commissioned by the Employee Ownership Association in the UK and written by a firm called Matrix Evidence, whose whole business is to synthesize data and produce what they call meta-analyses, the aggregation of different individual studies. And then finally, I've cited some research that RM2 does for the Employee Ownership Association, which is the annual league table of the largest 50 employee-owned firms, and we've analysed the performance of that group as a cohort year on year, which has produced some rather interesting results. So firstly, employee-owned firms have been shown now through at least the last 2 recessions to be more sustainable and more resilient through those economic cycles. The possible explanations of that are, first of all, the reference back to employee engagement and the notion that employees will work that much harder to get the business through a downturn. But there is also the element of variable pay that's implied in an employee share scheme, and perhaps the willingness of employees to take a short-term sacrifice, maybe a temporary reduction in fixed pay and benefits, in return for the prospect of greater variable reward post a downturn. One of the most thorough and large-scale longitudinal studies was in America in the 1990s, and this is a piece of work which has probably been cited most frequently, more frequently than anything else, namely that sales growth and employment growth are consistently stronger in American ESOP companies, that's the employee share ownership plan companies, the US style of ownership, especially where there are well-developed systems for employee involvement and participation. So this study was saying that ownership alone is not sufficient, and the benefits of ownership can only truly be unlocked if that's combined with a management culture and a leadership tone which makes the ownership feel real in everyone's day-to-day job. And the third observation in this category comes from the top 50 analysis that we do annually. We have shown that the largest 50 employee-owned firms have significantly higher productivity growth than firms of a similar size in the economy at large. So this cohort in 2015 produced a 4.5% year-on-year productivity growth compared to pretty flat productivity in the economy as a whole. I invite you to follow up some of these references and delve into a lot more detail. We should also look at the firm from outsiders' perspectives, not just the internal performance measurements, but how is an employer-owned firm viewed externally. And we've recently come across a very interesting piece of work done by a public benefit corporation in California called Ownership Alliance. They are promoting the use of an employee ownership certification, a mark, if you like, which companies can use if they can demonstrate they are truly employee-owned. And the survey, which was done over several thousand individuals, showed that American consumers, and then we repeated the survey in the UK, so British consumers, are willing to pay more, or would be willing to pay more, for products and services delivered by an employee-owned certified company. Consumers are more likely to buy from such a company, and the majority of consumers would associate that trademark with socially responsible business practices. Quite a striking set of results. It's true that in the UK we haven't got the same level of positive scores as was experienced in the United States, but I think the difference can be explained by just how far advanced the US practice of employee ownership is and how mainstream it is in America compared to its position in the UK. What was interesting as well was how the employee ownership mark scored favourably when compared to some other well-known consumer trademarks such as fair trade, such as the top companies to work for. So here is the making of quite a powerful business case for companies that are employee-owned and which are consumer-facing, so that would include retailers, to wear their ownership badge with pride, quite visibly on their corporate brand, because it does appear to play well and be positively received. And even a company that's not in the retail sector, which might just trade with other companies, I think could use such a certification internally for internal audiences, because it most likely will play well with an employee audience. Another external perspective on the firm is from shareholders and investors. And for many years I've been maintaining and publicising an index of UK listed companies which are significantly owned by employees on a broad basis. And I've been comparing that group with the stock market generally. And this study started back in the early 1990s when we set up the index originally to match an equivalent index in the United States, which sadly has fallen into, well, it's no longer compiled. We've maintained the UK index, though, through a number of stock market booms and busts. We certainly haven't beaten the market every year, and certainly not every quarter every year. But in the long run, the employee-owned companies have significantly outperformed the market benchmarks. We've chosen the FTSE All-Share in this chart. And the average annual outperformance, so this is an average margin of superior performance over the last 20 years, has been round about 10 percentage points. So that means, although there have been some down years, on average, employee-owned firms have delivered a 10% higher total return to their shareholders. And this addresses one of the most significant objections that some investors have about employee ownership. They worry about its impact on shareholder returns. They worry about dilution. They worry that company profits are going to go to undeserving owners. This study seems to show that that dilution is fully justified, because somehow it's translating into superior long-term performance. And I trot out this slide and slides like this whenever I'm faced with an audience of skeptical institutional investors, and I invite them to to pummel me with questions. There's a similar study in the United States. It's not quite directly addressing employee-owned companies. Instead, it's addressing the top 100 best companies to work for in America, many of which are employee-owned. In fact, I think most of which are employee-owned to some degree. That group of companies has outperformed the Standard & Poor's Index, 500 Index, by between 2.3% and 4% per annum over the long period of 1984 to 2011. So again, you'll be able to find that if you just Google top 100 best companies to work, stock returns. So finally, if we just look at this at the level of the whole economy, and here I think perhaps some of the claims are as much political as they are truly rigorously statistical. But bear with me and look at these constructively as well as critically and see if they stack up. So it has been claimed that employee-owned firms pay more corporate taxes and their employees claim less welfare than firms on average. The reason for that? Because they have a very transparent approach to accounting. They use very simple corporate structures. You won't find very many Luxembourg bare trusts in an employee-owned firm. You won't find a great use of offshore tax havens. You won't find much creative remuneration practice between owner-managers and employees. You'll find generally a pretty straight down the line approach. I guess from a public policy point of view, that's not a bad type of firm to be encouraging. Secondly, employee-owned firms create wealth arguably more equitably, and there are worries about the extent to which the spoils of capitalism are being spread, or rather concentrated, in the shrinking well-off part of the economy, and the wider part of the economy missing out altogether on the benefits of capitalism and globalization. So it is argued that giving employees a stake in corporate wealth is going to lead to a more stable and sustainable economy. I think arguably a more stable and sustainable democracy, but that's a bigger point. It's thirdly, employee ownership has been described, not very elegantly, but I think quite accurately, as a sort of pre-distribution way of spreading wealth. The problem with addressing wealth inequality by using the blunt instrument of taxation is that, well, no one likes wealth taxes, apart from possibly the pure recipients, but employee ownership is a way of creating new capital stock for new owners, and arguably is a much more progressive way to try and moderate what might otherwise be more polarized inequality. One of the great intellectual proponents of employee ownership, Louis Kelso, the founder of the American ESOP, argued very cogently that outside of the main asset classes of property, pensions, and those lucky enough to inherit, employee ownership is one of the few ways of creating new capital for very large sections of the population. Half the population at least is in a position to benefit from employee ownership, if only we had the means to extend it that far. Louis Kelso had some lovely pithy phrases, not all of which would necessarily score top marks in an investment exam, but he said, no one ever got rich from a diversified portfolio. So he's advocating the merits of putting eggs in one basket, especially a basket that employee owners know well and understand. But of course, I think many people would quite rightly argue that a degree of moderation and restraint is required, especially as one approaches the end of one's career and is looking to preserve wealth rather than grow wealth. So diversification absolutely has its place. But there is a growing school of thought which says that we should start to debate what was previously a taboo idea, namely that employee ownership could fill a gap that's being left by receding pension provision. Companies are now in the UK required to make a very basic level of contribution to a workplace pension, but that really is can only be described as a good start rather than a good solution. And there is a case for helping private companies especially to make bigger provision to employee ownership programs, partly as a form of retirement benefit provision for employees. I think private companies are much more likely to embrace that idea of retaining wealth in the company, retaining the capital stock of the company, rather than contributing it to some remote fund management firm to invest on their workers' behalf, and quite often making a big fist of that. So an interesting debate, and one that I'm sure will continue. And then finally, and this is one of the most utopian claims of all, but if you want some evidence, or shall we say a case for this, then look at well, a number of publications. There's the Spirit Level by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, which showed that societies around the world that had lower levels of inequality were absolutely shown to be happier, healthier, and had good community solidarity. And I don't think these studies fall into the trap of the divorce rate in Maine being correlated to margarine sales. There is definitely a direct cause and effect. And a long-standing UK advocate of employee ownership, David Erdl, has done a study of employee-owned businesses in around Bologna and found similar outcomes. So this is something which I think one can comfortably advocate from so many different angles. Just to conclude on a sort of note of extreme realism, we talk to a lot of private companies whose initial perception of employee ownership is somewhat negative. I mean, they like the idea, they like the concept, they like the goal, but there are anxieties about business owners losing control. There are anxieties about whether the dilution is going to be worthwhile. What happens to people who leave the company, and how do employee shares get kept internally? Worries about valuation when there's no stock market. Worries about no liquidity. And finally, the whole thing just sounds far too complicated. What I hope we can demonstrate, and we try and do this on a case-by-case basis, not just with PowerPoint slides, is show that employee ownership, the benefits that I've outlined, can unlock significant benefits, and the perceived complexities are eminently solvable. There's a lot of experience, a lot of technology now available to make employee ownership work very smoothly and straightforwardly, even in small private companies. And it would be a shame if private companies felt that this isn't quite for them because it's too difficult. So I've nearly used up the 30 minutes, but I'm very happy to see if we can have any questions. And so far I've got no questions, which is surprising if it's been completely clear, but I will invite you to email me at the email address shown on this final slide if you have any questions. If you'd like to gain access directly to any of the sources that I've mentioned, I will do my best to send you links. And we will be following up with a very short survey and invite you to just give us some feedback so that we can improve this webinar series and make it more valuable. So as I've used my allotted time, I'm going to say thank you very much for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at the next RM2 webinar.